and the SCVO Trustee Network. Thank you for coming along today. And while people are still joining us, do take the time to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you've got any questions you'd like to ask or any feedback that you'd like to give about the Charity Law Review, put them in the chat as well, and we'll have time at the end to go through those. Just to note that we're recording the session, and we will also send out the slides to you afterwards and links to further resources in a follow-up email. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Caroline Monk, Charity Law Team Leader at Scottish Government. And I'll now just hand over to her for her presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. I will just share my screen and hopefully that's worked. Okay. All right. Well, thank you to everybody for coming, and also thank you very much to SCVO and Tracy in particular for organising this session. I'm Caroline Monk. I'm the team leader in the charity law team at the Scottish Government. With me today are my colleagues Jill and Melissa, and together we are the small but perfectly formed charity law team. So I'm going to do a fairly quick and hopefully informative presentation for you about what our current consultation is about, how we got to this point, and how you can get involved. During the presentation, please feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go along, and we should have a pretty decent chunk of time for questions and discussions at the end. We've also got a couple of polls dotted throughout the presentation which mirror some of the questions from the consultation. So before getting into the consultation itself, I thought it might be helpful to just explain where we are in Scottish Government. So we're part of the third sector unit, and there are currently about 11 people making up 3 teams in that unit. And the third sector unit holds the strategic relationship with the third sector, but it doesn't have a relationship with the whole of the third sector, which is estimated to be around 46,000 organisations, of which 25,000 are charities. So there's different areas in Scottish Government that will hold relationships with different third sector organisations to do with their policy area. So for example, in health and education, justice, environment, that kind of thing. We tend to deal more with the kind of intermediary bodies or the sort of, national organisations such as SCVO. So the 3 teams that make up the unit are the volunteering team. They fund Volunteer Scotland, and they have the sort of key strategic relationship with them. They also oversee the Volunteering Action Plan, which is Scottish Government's commitment to the importance of volunteering. We have the third sector infrastructure team. They deal with the funding and relationship with the key intermediary organisations like SCVO and ACODSVO, and also the third sector interfaces. Then we have my team, the charity law team, and we deal with charity regulation, fundraising policy, and also the relationship with OSCR, the charity regulator. So what's this consultation about? It's split into 3 parts. And the first part is looking at the purpose of a review. So the consultation asks whether you think, A, there needs to be a review of charity regulation, and if you think there does, what the purpose of that should be. And it's really important that we understand why people feel things need to be reviewed, not just what they want to see reviewed, because that's going to help us decide the best way to do things. The second part of the consultation is around the parameters for a review, so what it should and shouldn't cover. And then the last bit is around technical areas that have already been identified that we need to have a look at. And we'll come on to those a bit later in the presentation. But first of all, we'd like to gauge your opinion on that initial question of whether or not there needs to be a review. And so I'm going to hand back to SCVO to do the first poll. Well, that's quite interesting. I think that's kind of mirroring a lot of what we're seeing in the consultation responses that we've received so far. Is there are a few people saying no, but the majority are saying yes, there does need to be a review. So that's quite consistent there. Okay, we'll move on with the consultation, and just a little bit about why we're having the consultation now. Why have we got one out at the moment? As probably some of you are aware, over the past few years, we've been working on new legislation around charity regulation. And that was in large part response to calls from OSCR, but also others to update and strengthen the existing law. So that's the Charities and Trustee Investment Scotland Act 2005, which as of next year will have been in place for 20 years. So when we were looking at the more recent changes, which were fairly sort of technical in nature, quite a few people, including SCVO, felt that there needed to be a broader look at charity law. As such, we said once we had completed the Charities Act 2023, which recently came into force, we'd look at that need for a broader review. So this consultation is really the start of that. And what we hope to get out of it is clarity on whether people think there does need to be a review, and if so, what the purpose and parameters of it should be. This slide just shows a wee bit of timeline as to how we got to the consultation. So with the recent changes starting in 2018 with proposals from OSCR, then we had a couple of consultations on those proposals in 2019 and 2021, which then led to the 2003 Act going through Parliament about this time last year. And the reason I put that up there is so you can kind of see sort of where this has come from. And also, although it looks like quite a long time, the work was delayed by COVID. However, it's also really important to note that creating new legislation, especially primary legislation, can be a really lengthy process. So these things don't happen overnight. Before we move on to look at the consultation questions, I thought it might be helpful to quickly go over the changes that have recently come into force, as well as some of our future plans. So we had the Charities Act last year, and that is being implemented in 2 phases. The first phase came into force on the 1st of April this year and included a number of additional powers for OSCR, which I think mostly shouldn't impact most charities. Those are powers for OSCR to use as needed. And there's more information about those changes on the OSCR website at the moment. The second phase we are looking to implement in summer 2025. And that's going to see some of the bigger changes, which will have an impact on all charities. So OSCR being able to publish all charity accounts unredacted, and the list of charity trustees on the Scottish Charity Register are just kind of 2 of the things which will impact everybody. As well as implementing the new Act, we're also going to be amending some of the existing legislation. So some of the regulations that sit underneath the Acts. The accounting regulations will need to be updated next year. And also the SCIO dissolution and removal regulations need updating as a result of the new Act. So we've got quite a bit of work already in the pipeline for continuing to update and strengthen charity law. Looking at the consultation itself, it's split into those 3 sections that I mentioned earlier. The consultation asks 10 questions, starting with that: do you think there needs to be a review, and if so, why? There are quite a lot of yes/no questions, and if you can only answer those questions, that's fine. That will give us a good kind of quantitative base from which to work from. But also, if you can provide us with more detail in the free text sort of explanation parts as well, that's really great, because then we can, get to the why as well as the what people want to see reviewed. So that brings us on to our second poll, which are questions around the purpose for a review. One of the options in this poll is to add other. And if you do choose other, if you could put that in the chat, just to explain what you mean by that, it would be really helpful. Thanks. Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for taking part in that as well. I think that's really interesting. I think that's almost exactly what we've got from current consultation responses at the moment. So that's really handy to know. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to some of the suggested topics for review. And so this next bit of the consultation looks at some of those potential areas. So thinking about the parameters of a review. Some stakeholders have already given us ideas as to what they would like to see reviewed. We want to understand whether people sort of generally agree with that, and very much welcome your opinions on that. So these three topics, charitable purposes, public benefit, and charity trustee duties, are all areas where stakeholders have told us that they think there needs to be a review. And these are really sort of fundamental parts of our existing charity law. So as well as understanding the appetite for reviewing these things, we would really like to understand why people feel they need to be reviewed. So what sort of issues would a review be trying to unpick or resolve in these different areas? And I think that brings us on to our final poll, just asking your thoughts on these particular areas. Okay, so again, not dissimilar to what we're seeing coming out of the consultation responses already. I think charitable purposes and public benefit are sort of split quite 50-50 at the moment. But charity trustee duties is clearly something that people feel is needing to be looked at. That's got quite a high percentage of people voting yes on that. We'll move on now to the last bit of the consultation around the technical strand. This is where we've listed some very technical issues that we know are causing some charities problems. And these are issues that we've committed to doing something about regardless of the outcome of this consultation. So we're highlighting these in part so you don't actually need to tell us about them. They are already on our radar. but also to see if you think there's anything else that should be included. The consultation paper that's on the government consultation website has quite a bit more detail about these things, because they are quite technical. But I'll just very briefly kind of run over what each of these 3 points mean. So the first one is reorganisation of statutory and royal charter charities. Now, this only affects a very small number of charities, but the impact on them can be really big. The way that these types of charities are set up means that when they want to make changes, when they want to reorganise and modernise their organisations, it's quite a complex and time-consuming process that they have to go through. So we want to see if there's a way that we can streamline that process and make it easier for all involved. The second area is the incorporation to a Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, or SCIO. So this process, quite often known as a change of legal form, and that's where you would have an unincorporated association that wants to become a SCIO, and there are lots of benefits around becoming a SCIO, not least the limited liability that it gives to trustees. But the process for doing that can be sometimes bring up some challenges. So you're taking the old unincorporated association, you're closing that down, you're setting up a new SCIO, and you're transferring all the assets and liabilities across. So things like contracts, property, employment, insurance, banking as well is quite a big issue. And it's that kind of in-between process that can bring some challenges for organisations. So that's an area that we'd like to have a look at, and again, see if there's anything that can be done to kind of streamline that process, or to just make it a bit more straightforward for people. And then lastly, there's audit income thresholds. So we're really aware that charities are finding it increasingly difficult to appoint an auditor. The current 500,000 threshold has been around for the last 20 years, and to be quite honest, some people have been calling for it to be raised. But equally, we know that audit availability is not just a kind of problem in Scotland, it's a UK-wide issue, and also it's not just a problem for charities, it's a problem for businesses as well. So we want to have a more holistic look at that, to see, again, if there's anything that we can do to help in these areas. And I think it's fair to say that there is no silver bullet to any of these problems. They are quite sort of knotty, complex legal issues. And so we want to take an in-depth look into each of them to see if there is any improvements that can be made in these areas. So the consultation closes at midnight on the 22nd of July. After that, we'll analyse the results and produce a report, which will be published. That will take quite a few months to do. But what we will be able to do a bit more quickly is to publish those responses where we've been given permission to do so you can see what other people have said. It really will be your views that will help us decide what the next steps should be. And once Scottish ministers have made a decision on what to do next, we'll publish that as well. So we'll make sure that everybody's kept updated. What I can't do at this moment in time is tell you exactly what will happen after the consultation, as much of that will depend on the outcomes that we get from it. So I can't tell you about timescales or scope or anything at the moment, because that's kind of why we're having the consultation, to try and help us determine those things. And that brings us to the end of the presentation, but it is very much the start of the process, and by no means the only chance to give us your views. If you do have any questions and you don't want to raise them in this forum, or they occur to you later on, please do just get in touch with us via the email address that's on the screen. We'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions. And looks like we'll have a decent chunk of time for a bit of discussion and questions as well. So I will shut up now and I will hand back over to SCVO.
Thanks, Caroline. Up to now, we don't have any questions other than one that I've just posted in the chat. So know that now's your chance. Please do put your questions in, or you can ask them directly if you put up your hand. Caroline, I've put a question in that we had this morning from a treasurer of a small charity, and they're concerned about the publication of accounts and whether the actual signatures are going to be on there for everybody to see, and, you know, a potential for IT scams. I wondered if you could say anything on that.
Yeah, so we've been talking with Oscar about this particular issue once the accounts do get published, or once the power to publish them comes in next year. So Oscar have already been accepting kind of typed signatures and stuff. They started doing that during COVID, and they're quite happy to accept basically non what they call it, wet signatures, essentially. So they're going to be doing quite a lot of guidance and communication around that, because obviously people would be concerned about, you know, kind of fraudulent activity and stuff. But yeah, Oscar it's more of a policy decision for Oscar, but they are going to accept things that haven't been signed by hand.
Okay, great, thank you. Does anybody else want to ask a question directly? If you want to put, I can see Viz Stewart, did you unmute you? Do you want to ask directly? Hang on. Don't know, do we ask to unmute?
I've tried to I've tried to unmute. Still not getting audio through.
We can hear you now, so if you want to ask your question.
Sorry, yeah. That question was the one I sent in this morning.
Okay.
And it was a very small charity, and the treasurer was quite worried about an actual signature appearing in public accounts. He wasn't worried at all about a printed name. I was thinking in terms of computer scams, and it set me thinking that perhaps others would have similar worries. So I sent it in this morning. So thank you for taking it so quickly.
That's good. And do you have a follow-up question or anything else you'd like to ask?
I think others will have similar sentiments over the question of an actual signature appearing on a public document, which could be possibly used for diverse resources. I think everyone's getting more and more worried about the security of these sort of processes, and a printed name is an entirely different matter from a copy of an actual signature. It does seem to be a very valid point.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got a new message. Let's have a look. Okay. Problem of charity banking. Yes, SCVO are aware of that. That comes in from Steph. And I've actually chatted with Steph about this. It's clear that the high street banking sector has lost touch with the vast majority of the charity sector. Now, the banking sector is heavily regulated. You know, they have to abide by anti-money laundering legislation, which can cause problems with getting trustees, verified signatures, that kind of thing. But Steph's asking, and I'm paraphrasing, Steph, you can come in if you want, you know, is there going to be a look at how regulators, legislators can adequately intercept to help combat these problems? Steph, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you got that, Tracy. Yeah, it's really just to see how we do know that there is a need to perhaps look at how legislators and particularly regulators intersect, and because it's now what's happened is with the anti-money laundering legislation, it's moved so far away from what charities look like that charities are getting hammered with the lack of understanding from banks. So one possible solution could be to look at how regulators and legislation intersects, essentially. As I don't know whether that's possible at all, to see how regulators can talk to one another on the back of what their legislation determines, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think I mean, as you're probably aware, the three UK charity regulators wrote to the the banks last year around this issue. And as I understand it, Oscar and Charity Commission in England and Wales and the one in Northern Ireland are all kind of persisting with that work, particularly with the Financial Conduct Authority. So I think it's probably more a regulator to regulator thing, certainly in the shorter term, because as we know, legislation can take an awful long time. But it is also something that we're discussing with our counterparts down at DCMS in UK government, and also counterparts in Northern Ireland, because again, this is not a Scottish only issue. It's very much a UK wide thing, and it is largely driven by the changes in the banking sector and the regulations that they're now coming under. But what it is helpful to do is to provide examples for the regulators to be able to take. So I think particularly when they're talking to the Financial Conduct Authority, the more examples they have of the sort of real world impacts, the better. Because I know that they do sort of go to these kind of roundtable discussions with the banks and stuff now. So things are being done, but it doesn't feel like really charities are seeing changes on the ground. And I think there's maybe a bit of a disconnect between, the folk in the head offices at the banks and the people in branch. But obviously SCBO have done a lot of work on this, and you've got your kind of, sort of recommended type of banks, or the kind of ranking of banks and stuff as well. And certainly when we get queries, which we quite frequently do get queries coming through to us, we will put, we will always signpost to that SCBO information, as well as the Oscar guidance on banking as well. But it's an issue, and it doesn't seem to be going away.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, it is a lot of systemic issues, but we do have a bank account comparison table, and I put that in the chat. So if you're not happy with your bank, I always say to people, vote with your feet. And there's all banks available that are more warm to the sector, shall we say, than maybe the high street ones. So do check that out. There's a question in from Sarah Latto. Sarah, are you happy to ask that yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And apologies, Caroline, because you heard from me last week at a similar event. So, but yeah, it was. So I'm, for those who don't know, I'm from Volunteer Scotland. And I think the particular reason why we think that there's a need for a review is around the burden on trustees as volunteers, and just the recognition that trustees do so in a voluntary capacity, most particularly for volunteers in smaller organisations where there's maybe not paid staff, so they're taking on quite a lot of the operational side of things, as well as the governance responsibilities. We do know that volunteering is in decline as well, so that's another particular concern. And I know that there's a lot of organisations really struggle to recruit trustees, and that's come through in the Oscar survey the last few times as well. I think one thing that we certainly called for in the last consultation, and we still feel is potentially a bit of an issue, is around how we can best support trustee diversity. So we know from the sort of limited figures that are out there that trustee diversity is pretty non-existent, that there's a real challenge in recruiting people from some sort of ethnic minority backgrounds, but also from different sort of financial backgrounds as well. And I know that there's a real push to have more volunteers or more trustees who've got lived experience of the issues of the sort of communities that the organisation that they're in serves. So how do we make that as easy as possible for people to get involved, whilst also obviously maintaining those regulatory responsibilities that are required?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and apologies you've had to listen to the same presentation again as well. But I mean, you're absolutely right. I suspect one of the reasons why we are seeing in the consultation responses so far such a kind of waiting on trustee duties wanting to be reviewed, or folk wanting those to be reviewed, is not just around the duties themselves, but actually what they mean in practice, and recruitment and retention. It's clearly something that's really linked there. And I think there's also, I mean, decline in volunteering, you know, this is a much bigger picture thing, but, you know, is there anything we can do in terms of, you know, the actual legislation and how that's implemented that makes that whole kind of experience a bit better, a bit easier? You know, these are conversations that I think certainly after the consultation, when we're thinking about next steps, you know, we really need to think about those areas. It's not just what the legislation says, but actually how it impacts in the real world. So looking forward to reading your response, definitely. Thanks.
Sarah. Anybody else want to ask anything? I was in a session earlier this month. There was questions around people wanting greater clarity about what is a charity and how it differs from social enterprise. So bringing in also religious organizations, private schools. I don't know if anybody has an opinion on that. Liability of persons with significant control who are not trustees. So that there were questions around that. You know, you've got Caroline here, so really do use her time. But if there isn't any other questions, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jason, and he can tell you a little bit more about what SCVO is doing around this. So I'll hand over to you now, Jason.
See, I've just got one quick question, Tracy.
Oh, sorry, Jane.
Sorry, I've just got one quick question, and not with my SCVO hat on, but with a trustee hat on. And just kind of feeding off what Sarah was just saying around the difficulty in getting trustees and lack of diversity. And I've just recently gone onto a board who are having exactly that problem. And it's intimidating if you've not been on a board before, because there's so much involved in it, and it's actually quite scary. And I'm wondering if there's any thought being put, Caroline, to when changes are made, how that's kind of disseminated out and that information's shared, because my fear is that it may in reality make matters better, but if it's not communicated in the right way, people will just see more stuff and go, oh, I'm not doing that. And that's probably a concern, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because there's one thing is making changes, but it's another thing making sure that folk actually know about the changes and can appreciate, you know, that hopefully the changes are actually there to benefit them, as opposed to just feeling like another thing that's being put on them. I think there's also something, you know, regardless of kind of what happens in terms of a review, there's also something about, you know, okay, well, maybe what's out there at the moment, can we do something kind of, you know, in the shorter medium term about the guidance and the support that's already out there at the moment, and just trying to make that a bit more straightforward or a bit more accessible as well? Because obviously I know SCVO have got a lot of stuff, Volunteers Scotland, the TSIs, Oscar, everybody's, you know, there's the governance code with the Third Sector Governance Forum as well. Maybe it's about how we can join those things up and kind of support people more immediately too, which I know is something Tracy's been banging on about for ages, and it's you know, it's not lost. And I think what's coming out of the consultation is kind of maybe that's not being prioritized by ourselves or by Oscar in the way that it could have been. So that's maybe going to give us a wee bit of a push as well.
Now, there's such a lot of support out there, but it's just really knowing where to go. I will give a plug here for the SCVO Trustee Network. If you're not signed up to that, you'll get a regular bulletin and news of webinars like that. Please do, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. I'm also going to put a link in for a really useful publication from Getting On Board. And they do a free guide for diversifying your board. That's really a good read. So go check that one out. There's another question come in from Steph as well. So Jason, we'll have to wait for you. And I think, again, Steph, do you want to ask that yourself, or do you want me to read it out?
I'll read it this time. Sorry, Caroline, it's me again. So it was actually just on the back of what Sarah said, because I did actually ask this question yesterday. But it was just about the consideration of minimum registration for the regulator, because obviously in England and Wales, there's voluntary registration under an income of 5k, and over that is a requirement for registration with the Commission. And Northern Ireland is considering introducing income of 20k for registration. And I just wonder whether that is talking about the administrative and financial and sort of the scary legal burden for trustees, whether that is something to consider. I mean, thinking about the size of the register in Scotland, you know, I think Northern Ireland, when I looked, I think there's probably about 7,000 charities in Northern Ireland, and we've got what, about 25,000. So, you know, and they're considering introducing a minimum, you know, a minimum registration income. So I just wondered, I know, Caroline, you've obviously given the answer, but I just wondered in case anyone else is considering it as well as something to look at.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steph, and apologies to you as well for having to hear the same presentation. But, you know, I think that's something, the idea of some kind of registration threshold, I think, is something I'm expecting to see in some of the consultation responses. You know, it's something that has been kind of muted quite a lot over the years, particularly because at the moment Northern Ireland have their consultation out on a, well, what Northern Ireland are doing is they are going to introduce a £20,000 threshold for registration. So anybody below that could register voluntarily, but wouldn't be required to. The consultation they've got out at the moment is actually about the mechanics of that. So not whether they should do it. Their minister took a decision that was going to happen. It's about how they do it and how they kind of get, you know, whether they include income and assets or just income when they're looking at those threshold things. And actually there's quite a lot in the consultation paper. There's a lot of things to unpick from charities that are already registered and subject to regulation about kind of, you know, what happens when something goes wrong with charitable assets and what kind of role would a regulator have if they're not registered. Or they're only voluntarily registered and things like that. So it's a really interesting consultation paper if you get a chance to have a look at it. But definitely, I would imagine that this is something that is going to crop up in the consultation and something that we'll need to look at. And the Cabinet Secretary has been quite clear that nothing's on or off the table at this moment in time. So this consultation is about finding out what people think.
And just to clarify, Caroline, that would be if you had an income, for example, of less than £20,000, you could still call yourself a charity in Northern Ireland. Is that the thinking?
Well, that's one of the many, many questions that they've got, basically, is whether you could still call yourself a charity. I think, and those, you know, different options in the consultation. There's also a lot of different things about, well, what if you know, 1 year you happen to tip over that registration threshold because you've had a big donation, which is quite similar to the kind of audit threshold problems and stuff as well. So it's, if you're geeky like me, it's a very interesting paper to read and just think about all the different things that you need to unpick when you start putting thresholds in and having voluntary registration as well. I think the other thing to say is pretty sure that UK government has a legal duty to review their thresholds under charity legislation. So at some point in the future, they'll need to review their registration thresholds and things like that as well. So I think there's quite a lot happening in that area. It's going to be quite interesting to see what comes out.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with being geeky, Caroline. Sarah, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come back in?
I do, yeah, and I would agree. Nothing wrong with being a geek. I am a self-professed volunteering geek. So it was just to pick up on the point around sort of income thresholds and whether it's income or assets. That's a really interesting one, because we've just through quite a lot of the consultation that we've been doing in support of sort of responses around community wealth building and community empowerment and that kind of thing. There's actually quite a lot of cynicism out there from volunteers and trustees in smaller sort of community-based organisations, particularly around things like community asset transfer, and a sort of sense that quite often communities are taking on assets because they're the local authority is no longer going to manage them. So they feel like they don't really have a choice if they want to take on that asset. So I think that's a kind of separate issue. But I think that there needs to be a recognition that given the Scottish Government has got this emphasis on community asset transfer as a model that they are actively pursuing and encouraging, that a lot of quite sizable assets that are worth a fair amount of money are in the hands of volunteer-run community groups. And certainly some of the stories that I've heard from volunteers around that is it's what one volunteer referred to as community liability transfer, and the sort of challenges around that. So I think it's just something to keep in mind when we're talking about income thresholds, that actually with assets, a lot of very small community groups take on assets that are worth quite a lot of money, and that's maybe something just to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think the Northern Ireland consultation paper sort of very clearly sets that out. You can have very small amount of income, but actually really, really large charitable, fixed charitable asset. So I'd be surprised if they go for income only, but that's just my own personal view. That's not Scottish Government, so don't quote that.
Okay, thank you. Some really useful discussions here. I think that's it for the questions, but if you do think of something later, get in touch with us at inquiries@scvo.scot. But I would like to thank Caroline for that presentation and for you all for your questions. And before we finish, I'm now going to hand over to Jason.
Thanks, Tracy. It's just a very quick and potentially anticlimactic contribution for me after the build up there. It's just really to say that, as always, SCVO's policy team are obviously working on our own response to the consultation. We're really keen to try and encourage as many contributions as possible from other organisations, rather than just looking to particularly reflect the views of the sector. So first and foremost, we're trying to promote the consultation. So if you do have the desire and the capacity to complete it, please do so. But of course, if anybody wants to share their thoughts with SCVO, ask questions, raise issues with the policy team, please do get in touch. That can be about the idea of a wider review, the consultation itself, or in fact, if you don't have the capacity to obviously take the time to respond and you want to feed in some thoughts to SCVO's response, that's also totally fine. You can just get in touch with me. It's jason.henderson@scvo.scot. I'll pop that in the chat just so you can copy and paste it if you want to get in touch immediately. But that's really it. And thanks very much for coming along today.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, that's been a really useful session, I think. Thanks again to Caroline and to Jason and everybody else that asked questions. Really appreciate your engagement in this. And that's it from us. So thank you all, and you're getting 15 minutes back of your lunch hour. So enjoy. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.